Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michael Kahn, the Director of Operations and Policy at the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, a collaborative national platform that brings together prosecutors, policy experts, and communities to build a criminal legal system that promotes community-centered standards of safety, fairness, and dignity. Please follow us at IIP, John Jay, and prosecution.org. Please also be on the lookout for our upcoming curriculum on trauma-informed prosecution, available through our website next week. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that the IIP is based in New York City, which is Lenape-Hoking, the Lenape homeland. We honor all of the indigenous nations and their land with great gratitude and acknowledge the genocide and continuous displacement of indigenous peoples. We also acknowledge the enslaved Africans whose labor built New York City during the colonial era and beyond. We acknowledge the harm inflicted upon the indigenous communities and people of color across the country, in particular against the Black communities, which inspires our ongoing work. I ask that you join me for a moment of silent acknowledgement. The content in today's discussion may be particularly sensitive, and we encourage you to step away if necessary for your well-being. The IIP is honored to have some of the country's foremost leaders on the challenging issues of what prosecutors can do about prison reform. We invite respectful questions from the audience through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen, which the moderator will incorporate throughout the conversation. To welcome our speaker, I'm pleased to introduce IIP Director Lucy Lang.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you all for joining us today. This issue is particularly dear to us at the IIP and to me personally because our program inside criminal justice brings together prosecutors and incarcerated students to study criminal justice together in prisons. And the program has really illuminated the extent to which prosecutors are simply unaware of the realities of the facilities on which they regularly rely to fulfill their duties. This issue is incredibly timely right now, given how COVID-19 has shown a light on prison conditions and their heartbreaking health consequences, and has demonstrated that district attorneys, in collaboration with courts, police, corrections, and the defense bar, can take action in response to those conditions. At the IIP, we've started to explore the possibility of prosecutorial advocacy, creative internal policy, and even impact litigation as levers for improving conditions of confinement nationally. And we are thrilled to bring together leaders who are thinking about just that. First, I'm pleased to introduce Daryl Atkinson, who is the co-director of Forward Justice, a law, policy, and strategy center dedicated to advancing racial, social, and economic justice in the United States South. Prior to forming Forward Justice, Mr. Atkinson was the first Second Chance Fellow for the U.S. Department of Justice, where he advised the Second Chance portfolio of the Bureau of Justice Assistance and was a member of the Federal Interagency Reentry Council. In 2014, Mr. Atkinson was recognized by the White House as a reentry and employment champion of change for his extraordinary work to facilitate employment opportunities for people with criminal records. Mr. Atkinson is a founding member of the North Carolina Second Chance Alliance and serves on the North Carolina Commission for Racial and Ethnic Disparities in the Criminal Justice System. I'm pleased now to introduce District Attorney Diana Becton. DA Becton has spent most of her professional career as a judge, lawyer, and manager. In 2017, she was sworn in as the 25th District Attorney for Contra Costa County, California. She is the first woman, the first African American, and the first person of color to serve as Contra Costa District Attorney since the office was established in 1850. Following her appointment from the Board of Supervisors, DA Becton was elected to the position in June of 2018. DA Becton previously served for 22 years as a judge in Contra Costa County, where she was elected as presiding judge. She is past president of the National Association of Women Judges, the nation's leading voice for women in the judiciary, and past chair of the State Bar Council on Access and Fairness. Jill Habig is the founder and president of the Public Rights Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to eliminating the gap between the values expressed in our laws and the lived reality of our most vulnerable communities. Public Rights Project, or PRP, empowers state, local, and tribal governments to protect the core rights and freedoms that define us as Americans by providing them with talent and resources to more proactively enforce their residents' legal rights. Before founding PRP, Ms. Habig was Deputy Campaign Manager and Policy Director for Kamala Harris for U.S. Senate. Prior, she served as special counsel to then Attorney General Harris, advising the AG on legal issues and policy initiatives, including consumer fraud, health, education, human trafficking and civil rights, and gender and LGBTQ+ rights. In 2015, she led the creation and launch of the AG's Bureau of Children's Justice. Finally, I'm thrilled to introduce our partner, Stanley Richards. Mr. Richards is the Executive Vice President of the Fortune Society, a service and advocacy nonprofit organization in New York City, whose mission is to support successful reentry from prison and promote alternatives to incarceration. In 2014, Mr. Richards was recognized by the Obama administration as a champion of change. He was the first formerly incarcerated person to be appointed to the New York City Board of Corrections. As vice chair of that board, in June of 2020, Mr. Richards was appointed to lead the working group to end punitive segregation. Amongst others, his appointments include the Independent Commission on New York City Criminal Justice and Incarceration Reform, which released a blueprint for the future of criminal justice in New York City, including smaller, safer, fairer, a roadmap to closing Rikers Island. Thank you all so much for being with us, and thank you to everyone in the audience. It's really exciting to see such a great assortment of partners from across the country who serve in all different areas of criminal justice and in criminal justice reform. So I'm going to start by asking you, Mr. Richards, to help frame the issue for us. Why are prison conditions such a pressing issue that's central to meaningful legal reform, and why should prosecutors care?
Because, you know, when you look at where we're at as a nation, when we talk about criminal justice reform, when we talk about police reform, we have to look at the role prosecutors play in that system. And we are at a moment now where we have chipped away in various aspects of our criminal justice system to where we're at a place now where prosecutors are front and center in this discussion about criminal justice reform, be it prison conditions, be it reentry, or be it the front door incarceration. And the work that all of the leaders on this call have been doing for years has brought us to this point now where we need to really look at the role of prosecutors and how prosecutors can change the trajectory of our criminal justice system. And that goes for prosecution, that goes for conditions of confinement, and it goes for reentry. And when I look at the three pillars that Jeremy Travis spoke about in his paper, those are the three pillars that we need to be engaging our prosecutors in, right? And those pillars are how have we as a society used punitive excess to where we have the mass incarceration system we have right now? How do we promote equity in our criminal justice system so that our prosecutors aren't blind to the fact about who's going in and don't stop caring about the criminal justice system once the conviction has happened? In other words, what happens to people when they come home? And then really having our criminal justice system by way of our prosecutors to affirm the humanity of everybody who's involved in it. That is the victims of crimes in the community, that is the perpetrators of crimes in the community, and that is all of the associated family members and loved ones of those impacted by the criminal justice system. That we have to make sure that we affirm that humanity, that their humanity doesn't stop at arrest, and it doesn't stop while people are incarcerated, and it doesn't stop when people return home. So we're at a moment now where we need to come together and we need to lift up prosecutors who have taken the oath to move forward, not just to prosecute cases, but to be thoughtful about how it's done and their role in that system. So we're at a very unique moment that we need to harness.
I'm sure that some of the prosecutors in the office will feel the way that I felt for some of my career as a prosecutor, which is to say, I don't have control over corrections. My job is to handle the case at this moment in time, and it's not up to me to address the conditions on the other end. Ms. Habig, what would you say to that? What can local prosecutors do? And can you lay out a bit about the landscape of criminal and civil authority of district attorneys' offices? Yeah, sure. Thanks, Lucy. So, I mean, I think one of the things that we sort of a core area of focus for Public Rights Project is to look for ways to shift more prosecutorial resources to hold actual systems and power to account. And so I think when we think about the prison system, there's arguably no clearer example of power, disproportionate power and systemic racism than the US prison and jail system. So, you know, starting from that principle, it should absolutely be the job of the prosecutor to address conditions in the prison system because they affect public safety, and the prosecutor's job is public safety. And I think we have to get away from this old school notion of incarceration as a method of protecting safety. What we know now is that it actually undermines safety, particularly when conditions are so inhumane and unsafe within the prison system itself. So looking at what the kind of menu of options are for DAs to be advocates on this issue, I think different DAs and different local and state prosecutors, if you think about state attorneys general, they may have different legal authority on this issue, but I think the main point is that there is always some option for advocacy for prosecutors to take to address prison conditions. So a couple of examples. The first and maybe most obvious would be criminal prosecution of individual officers for deaths in the prison system, you know, other civil rights abuses, criminal abuses, and things like that. And so there have been a number of DAs who have criminally investigated or prosecuted individual officers, similar to the way that they would prosecute law enforcement officers on the street. And so, and in addition to the prosecution itself, the investigation can also lead to more systemic recommendations that the DA can publish and use their mantle to call for change within the system. So to give a couple of examples, DA Wesley Bell in St. Louis investigated the deaths of 2 young men in the county jail last year and provided some recommendations to improve operations at the jail coming out of that investigation. Stephanie Morales, the Portsmouth, Virginia Commonwealth attorney, also released a report after the death of someone who was incarcerated there with a series of recommendations about the systemic failures that had occurred in that system. So criminal investigation, and even, you know, we should have more criminal prosecutions, but the investigation itself can lead to other systemic recommendations. Another opportunity is civil advocacy in the courts. And this is an area that is not always as familiar to prosecutors because we tend to think of prosecutors just as criminal law officers. But a lot of DAs actually have some kind of civil prosecution authority, and particularly state attorneys general often have civil prosecution authority. And that's how you could actually address a systemic breakdown within a police department or a jail system. So that authority may not be available to all DAs, so we could talk about some of those challenges later, but there may be an opportunity to pursue a civil rights investigation of a jail system or a county. Another opportunity, even if they don't have direct authority for a civil prosecution, DAs can file amicus briefs. You know, state and local prosecutors can file a brief in a civil rights investigation filed by a private party and articulate the DA's interest or the state attorney general's interest in safety within the prison. And so Tish James in New York has done this before and filed an amicus brief in a lawsuit over conditions in the Metropolitan Detention Center, for example. And then the final opportunity is policy advocacy. You know, prosecutors have a position of public trust, they have a mantle, they have a bully pulpit, and they can advocate for legislation changes, for policy changes within local detention facilities, jails, and prisons. That can include things like, you know, a number of states are considering and have passed legislation to ban private prisons, for example, where we know that abuses are even more rampant. DAs can support that legislation. Immigration detention centers are another area where there's just rife with abuse, and prosecutors can support legislation to rein in immigration detention facilities. And they can also use their mantle to call for policy and protocol changes within the local sheriff's department. So those are just a few examples. DA Becton, given the breadth of your experience on the bench and now as a prosecutor, how do you see a prosecutor's role in addressing this fitting in? And I'm thinking in particular about your encouragement to your prosecutors to visit local jails and prisons. Does that make a difference? Why? And how do you see it going forward? Oh, unmute yourself. There's always one.
Me today. So I think it's very important to recognize that traditionally prosecutors have been used to, in our role as district attorneys and our approach to community safety, we have been very accustomed to using a very punitive approach when we think about community safety. And we very seldom think about when we are recommending sentencing, for example, we might very seldom think about the places where we're sending people or the conditions that they might find when they arrive. But as prosecutors, we really are responsible for the safety of everyone in our community and in our jurisdictions. And that is inclusive of those who are incarcerated. So that's why I thought it was so important for me to lift my voice and to join other elected prosecutors around the country last year to a commitment, first of all, to personally visit jails and prisons and detention facilities, as well as not forgetting about our youth in juvenile facilities as well. And the goal is to make this visit, at least the goal in my office is to make this type of a visit an integral part of everything that we do. We've had our juvenile team, for example, make sure that they go to the ranch, which is a place where many of our lower level offender youth are kept, as well as our juvenile locked facility. And we have an ultimate goal of making sure that a visit to a facility is part of our new prosecutor training and that it's incorporated into that training. I think it's really important for prosecutors to understand the impact of the decisions because prosecutors routinely recommend, as I mentioned, prison sentences. However, if we've never set foot in a prison, then we really don't understand, we don't fully understand the institutions themselves that we're sending people into. So I think the idea is that prosecutors have the opportunity in our offices to at least have a glimpse, to get a look, to get close up to those who've been impacted by the actions and the recommendations that we're making every single day. I think the visits give a prosecutor an added perspective, and it can help inform the decision-making, decisions about whether to push for a lengthy prison sentence versus considering other alternatives that might still keep our community safe, which is, of course, something that we're always concerned about. I think visiting a prison as well as our juvenile detention facilities is so very important. I think it's an eye-opening experience. I've had a chance not only to visit and to tour, but also to sit in circle, especially at San Quentin with men who've been incarcerated, and to hear their stories and to hear about how they are using their time to now help others so to keep them out of the criminal justice system. It's a very moving experience to meet side by side, even with those men who know that they may never have the possibility of getting out, but who've now had an opportunity to participate in reform, to participate in dealing with the trauma and the issues that they've been presented with as youth that may have gotten them to the point of being involved in our criminal justice system. And it really opens the eyes to be able to see that there are so many different ways that we could have handled these particular cases, perhaps at an earlier stage, so that we don't have so many people who are ending up behind bars. And it allows us as prosecutors, when we hear those stories, to also envision different outcomes for them and for our community as a whole as we think about public safety.
Atkinson.
I'd just like to add really quick, because what DA Becton is talking about is that's affirming humanity in action. That one of the things we say at Fortune Society is the crime is what people did, it's not who they are. And in society, we tend to say that the crime people committed, that's who they are. That's how we see them. and it never changes. And what DA Becton is doing is saying, I need to go in and see where I'm sending people, because their humanity doesn't stop at arrest. Their humanity doesn't stop at the jail cell or in the courtroom. And I need to understand where I'm sending them and what experiences they're having, because I am responsible not only for the victim that I'm representing them as a community member. So thank you, DA Becton, because that is affirming humanity in action.
And thank you for up the humanity, because I think what happens is so often, if we can objectify people, if we can put labels on them, if we can put numbers on them, then we stop seeing them as human beings, as people who deserve basic human rights. And so I think that's another reason why it is so important to visit and to have that at the forefront of our conversation. We're talking about fellow human beings.
So this principle is really what led to the development of the IIP's Inside Criminal Justice Program, which we encourage DAs everywhere to consider adopting, and the replication materials are available through our website and the Motion for Justice website that we published with the Vera Institute. But one takeaway I've had from the class is that proximity and humanity is only the first step towards making actual policy change. So, Mr. Atkinson, I would love for you to talk a bit from where you sit about whether you are optimistic about the future of prosecution and prison reform in general.
Yeah, I want to thank you for having me, Lucy, and I want to be directly responsive to the question briefly, and then I'll expand. No, I am not optimistic, and I think COVID-19 has really laid bare that we are nowhere near the kind of criminal legal reform kumbaya that we were claiming to be. And it's really shown through our inaction around this pandemic. But before I even get into that, I just think, in this moment of reckoning, when we're all looking and examining our role and examining, this country and the legacy of white supremacy and structural racism, that it's important to acknowledge that when we think of safety and public safety, Black, Brown, Indigenous folks, you did the recognition of the land that IIP stands on. There has never been a time in this country where the safety and wellness of Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks was preeminent in our society. That has never existed. That time has never been. So when we talk about facilitating the safety and wellness of Black and Brown communities, right, and a prosecutor's role in that, I think we have to acknowledge that structural racism is baked into our jurisprudence. That's why we have these ridiculous standards that we have to overcome. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the case that we were able to do that in North Carolina. But it has to be completely uprooted in all manners of our society, and our legal system is one. And merely perpetuating the existing status quo means that we're perpetuating white supremacy. I just need to name that very clearly, because that is the foundation which this country is built upon. As far as like the pandemic really kind of revealing that the emperor has no clothes, I mean, in North Carolina, our organization, in coalition with some other civil and human rights organization, filed COVID litigation against our governor and our Department of Public Safety, because they lived in, people inside live in congregate living facilities. We know those are the epicenters of spread for this particular disease. It's impossible to keep people 6 feet apart. And that's the only known mitigation practice that you can practice to avoid the spread of this disease. So we bought a preliminary injunction and filed under our state constitution, Article 1, Section 27, which is our analog to our cruel and unusual punishment statute at the state constitutional level, that DPS is in action in doing whatever they had to do, whether it be mass release, mass testing, surveillance testing, whatever they had to do to facilitate the ability of people to be 6 feet apart, was a violation of Article 1, Section 27 of our state constitution. And so we had two relevant standards, right? We filed this preliminary injunction. You got the preliminary injunction standard, and that's the likelihood of success. And you have to show that if you don't grant the injunction, that irreparable harm or substantial harm could occur. And then you have the Eighth Amendment standard. And I talked about how white supremacy is baked into the jurisprudence. The Eighth Amendment standard, anyone who's done prison conditions litigation, it is an extremely high burden to meet. You have to find deliberate indifference, and that deliberate indifference also has to be coupled with a substantial risk of harm. And so we were able to show, and the court found that the plaintiffs, we had a very substantial likelihood of success on the merits, that the Department of Public Safety and the governor was going to be found to be in violation of Article 1, Section 27 of our state constitution, because they were deliberately indifferent in the following ways. Number one, they had done no mass testing. We have a prison population of roughly about 33,000 folks. At that point, when the order was given, they had tested less than 5% of the population. So they were literally sticking their heads in the sand, not trying to understand the scope of the problem. Number two, they had continued intra-facility transfers during this time. So they're not testing, and then they're transferring people from facility to facility, despite the fact that we had one of the largest outbreaks in a women's facility at our Women's Correctional Institution in Raleigh. Despite the fact that we had one of the largest state outbreaks at Noose Correctional, where over 70% of the population tested positive out of 700 people inside. Despite the fact that we've had one of the largest federal outbreaks at Butner Correctional Facility. And despite all of this, they weren't testing, and they were continuing to transfer. And then lastly, they had disparate mitigation practices from facility to facility. We got 55 different prisons. We got affidavits from people inside. Some folks had masks, some folks didn't. Some folks were so-called cohorting. They were supposed to be cohort distancing. Some folks weren't. And so the judge ordered a few different things. One, that DPS accelerate their statutory authority around extended limits of confinement. That's where people can serve their sentence outside of a correctional facility, and they can, basically, it's like you're serving your sentence on probation. So they were to ramp that up and speed that process up, as well as they were to extend more gain time credits where more people would reach their statutory minimum, which would facilitate more release. They also had to do mass surveillance testing and consistent testing to make sure that they understood the scope of the problem. And then finally had put a moratorium on the transfers. That's at the state level. And at that state level, our Attorney General, Josh Stein, and his lawyers who represent his office were defending the Department of Public Safety vigorously. And I guess folks can say that's their job, or they could choose, no, in this moment of this pandemic, we're not going to defend this lawsuit. That could be a choice. At the local level, we've seen some leadership from some of our local prosecutors in consenting to post-conviction relief remedies. We have post-conviction relief motions for appropriate relief, where you essentially, if there was some kind of constitutional violation or procedural violation at the trial level, you could go back and fix that and essentially change the sentence. So in the wake of the pandemic, our Durham DA, Satana DeBerry, has went back and changed sentences and consented to these motions for 15 people who were immunocompromised, who had their convictions originate out of the Durham County, where she had some requisite authority.
Thank you for that. So let's take up this COVID-19 question, what we can learn from it, the ways in which there have been some successes, and the ways in which there were really missed opportunities, tragically. I'm going to ask you, Ms. Habig, to start, and then DA Becton, if you would jump in.
Yeah, I think that Daryl was absolutely right that COVID has really, across virtually any topic you pick, COVID has exposed the structural systemic inequities at the heart of every single public system we have. from the prison system to public education to, you know, pick your system. It has really laid bare the challenges that we face and really the systemic design of inequity. And so I think when it comes to COVID, I mean, the most direct impact that prosecutors can have is really to send fewer people, you know, to prison in the first place, and to release as many people as possible as quickly as possible. And there are certainly things that can and should be done, like he outlined in terms of the internal conditions for those who are left. But the two most direct opportunities for prosecutors are to send fewer people and get more people out. So I think, you know, just given the urgency of COVID, I think those are the two biggest areas of focus in the middle of this pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree as well. I think that if there are two places, and I agree that we can really focus our attention, the first would be to suspend any new detentions, and really first talking about our local jail facilities as a priority, unless we have a compelling public safety reason to move forward with those kinds of requests. And then to advocate and also to be a part of the discussions to reduce overcrowding and to facilitate and be a part of the discussions to help with early release. We have to identify and release immediately, and we have participated in those discussions along with our other justice partners, those who do not pose a public safety risk, and especially those who are elderly, for one. Those who might be vulnerable, such as people that have pre-existing conditions like cancer and asthma, people have lung disease, all of those conditions that make them at much greater risk for COVID-19 are places we can concentrate. And then for those who have short time left on their sentences, to advocate for the early release of those as well. I think another place that's important to think around is hygiene within our facilities, making sure that there are adequate supplies and that people have access, like free phone calls and things of that nature. And then finally, as well as taking every effort to improve the mental health of those who are behind bars.
Can I make one other point, Lucy? I'm sorry. I think just when we're thinking about the fallout of COVID and the safety and health and well-being of each jurisdiction as a result of this pandemic, there is an effect from the economic fallout that is really undermining families' health and safety that I think prosecutors can also address outside of the prison system. So things like housing, access to housing for people who have lost their income, things like, you know, still rampant wage theft from corporations, particularly against frontline workers who have no choice but to put themselves in harm's way. And so when we think about that broader definition of safety and what it means for people to be safe in this moment, I think we also need to have prosecutors think about those economic aspects and the economic predation that families are facing, whether it's unlawful evictions, wage theft, other conditions that affect everyone's safety and certainly affect the well-being and safety of those who are being released and their ability to actually maintain safety for themselves.
And
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, dear.
I was going to say there's one other thing I failed to mention as well, and that is for us as prosecutors to be on the front line of the discussions about bail, because that is another place where so many people, especially the disparate impacts, have to be focused on for people of color and people who do not have adequate resources. So many people are sitting awaiting trial, have not yet been convicted of anything, who are behind bars solely, not because they pose any public safety risk, but solely because they cannot afford to make bail. And so I think this is another place where we can do the advocacy work as prosecutors and also to use our voices to advocate against for bail reform in our communities.
And I was just going to add, and we've seen, like in New York City, we've seen where the city has taken steps. I don't believe they went far enough, but in the collaboration with the various district attorneys, released people who were vulnerable for the COVID, placed them in hotels for those who didn't have housing, had those hotels being provided, having those men and women being provided services through the nonprofit social service network. And we brought the number down. We have slightly under 3,900 people in New York City in detention. Not far enough, but that was an example of how we can do it. On the state level, we didn't see that. We seen the state come in and reduce the number of people who are facing parole violations. That number has come down significantly. That's part of the 3,900. But we haven't seen that kind of release and thoughtfulness and partnership on the state level. We still have so many vulnerable seniors in our system who've been in for a long term and pose no threat to community safety, that we ought to be looking at and saying, why aren't we releasing them? And so we have examples of where it has been done, not done to the extent many want it to be, but we've seen here in New York City an example of how you can do it.
Maybe it's Friday. I'm tired. I don't want to be Daryl Downer today, but look, I love the community of smart on crime, not tough on crime prosecutors that Lucy and others are building. But let's be really, really honest, folks. This is a thimble. It's like represents a fraction of the prosecutorial community around this country, right? This is not the sentiment writ large that is shared around the country. And that has serious consequences for people right now. People are in harm's way, people are dying, people are suffering as a result of the inaction of what the larger prosecutorial community is not doing, right? Let's just be real, real honest about that. I would say one other additional kind of mitigation practice that could be taken up that Jill brought up about the economic winter that is coming. These $600 payments are about to end. Winter is coming for those 41 million folks who applied for unemployment and who've been out of work and who's struggling to make it and get by. Prosecutors should waive any debt, fees, remit costs. They should advocate for that when courts open back up. Your Honor, there should be no court costs. No, we don't want any court costs, any fees or fines associated with someone's prosecution. Because the last thing a family and economic need needs is that court debt and the threat of a failure to comply or a failure to pay hanging over their head when they're trying to put food on the table. That's something super tangible that all prosecutors could make commitment to do that's really going to have an impact on people's economic livelihood.
Yeah. So I want to think a little bit about other sort of practical ways that prosecutors could develop protocols for addressing some of these issues. And Ms. Habig, we've talked before about, for example, the development of a civil rights enforcement unit. To your mind, what would that look like? Is that possible at all DA's offices? And how would a DA's office, for example, with solely criminal authority, be able to move forward with some of the conditions issues we're talking about?
Yeah, so I think that there are a range of options depending on the jurisdiction. And I think the main message I would say is that all prosecutors can do something and therefore should do something. What it would look like might vary a little bit. And I think about this in a couple ways. I think as Daryl mentioned, especially at the state prosecutor level, a lot of state AGs, most state AGs are also the defense attorney for jail systems, for the State Department of Corrections and things like that. Now, as he mentioned, they can absolutely decide not to defend in a particular case. They could also use their role as an attorney in a case to advise their client about what the state constitution actually requires, what the law requires, et cetera. So they can use their mantle in different ways. Some local prosecutors also have that defense attorney relationship. Like if we're thinking big about systemic changes, we might want to revisit giving prosecutors both of those roles, because it can really lead to, if you're supposed to be the law enforcement officer upholding the law, upholding people's rights, then if you have a conflict, if you're also defending some of those cases, I think that might be worth revisiting as a policy matter. But what I think a lot of DAs could do right now is they could, DAs like, DA Becton and others are starting to look at conviction integrity units. They could use a civil rights unit to review those convictions. They could review excessive sentences. A number of DAs in California are starting to do that and release people more quickly. They can also use their authority to make sure that folks who are released are getting every right that they're entitled to under the law, whether that's accessing housing, accessing employment, accessing all of the general rights that folks have once they're released. When it comes to prison conditions internally, I think a lot really depends on their direct role. There may need to be policy changes at the state level to actually give more DAs civil rights prosecution authority over prison conditions. That's something that at the local level, fewer DAs have. At the state level, state attorneys general could definitely look at civil rights investigations of county facilities, for example. That's something that we looked at in California a lot. We investigated local school police departments, probation departments, et cetera. And so that is one option, especially at the state level, that state prosecutors could look at.
So it seems that one issue is that very often the jails and prisons on which prosecutors rely are not in fact within their jurisdiction. So it makes it easier to look away. And in fact, if a prosecutor, say from Manhattan, was concerned about what was happening at Rikers Island, that's in the jurisdiction of the Bronx. So we're talking about a bit about just shrinking the population and how that improves conditions to some extent. And that's become all the more clear during COVID. But Mr. Richards, I want to ask you a bit, because you've done so much work on conditions in the sort of truest sense. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what prisons should and could look like and how you have worked with multiple stakeholders to try to further that conversation.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Lucy. I mean, Daryl took a trip to Europe and saw some of the prison institutions as I did. And what we've seen is a model that really said the conditions of confinement shouldn't be the punishment. The punishment is the removal from the community, that you are no longer in the community, you're not connected to your family in that kind of way. And the conditions of confinement should be such that it, as best as possible, replicates what it would look like and what it would be like for you once you go home. Because the job of the institution is to prepare you for life back in your community. And so the conditions should not be conditions that further traumatize people, further isolate people, further do damage to those who work in those institutions and those who are detained in those institutions. So we have models of how we could be in the United States. But I want to tie this question back to what Daryl was saying about Daryl being a Friday downer. You're not being a Friday downer. You're speaking truth to the way that this nation operates on the basis of race. And what we need prosecutors to do, what we need our conditions of confinement to look like, should, as I said, be about the humanity of those who are there. And we need to get out of the silence from the prosecutors who are doing the right thing, who are doing the thing about trying to address racism and end the disproportionate impact on Black and brown people in our criminal justice system. We need to ask them to speak up and speak out on this racism. And I feel like part of what we're doing and part of what is going on in IIP is about elevating aspects of the system that are speaking to that. And we need more prosecutors to join and speak up and speak out. And when we see prosecutors not or pretending like the system isn't built on racism, that it is not skewed toward disproportionate impact on Black and brown people, we need to say stop it, because it's not right. And just like you started, Daryl, by saying in North Carolina, they had a choice. They did not have to contest the lawsuit. They could have said, you know what, we agree. We are doing the wrong thing. And it's based on a disproportionate impact of Black and brown people. Just look at the system. You don't have to do anything further. So our conditions of confinement need to be based in the humanity of everybody. And we need more allies to be speaking up and speaking out against the racism that is inherent in our system.
Yeah, Stanley, I mean, you're exactly right, because I'll give you a really specific example. We had a redistricting lawsuit that was brought, and our state attorney general chose not to defend that lawsuit, chose not to fight it, right, and stood down. But this, and I want to try to tie a couple of threads here. This is why the point that you're making around human dignity is so important. And you mentioned that trip that me and some other folks took abroad, where we visited Germany and Norway. And Germany, as part of their reckoning post-World War II, enshrined human dignity into their constitution. They enshrined human dignity into all of their various institutions, because they knew if they did not keep that value in front of their face, it could be so easily to retreat back to past ways, right? And we're seeing, even now, we're seeing attacks in the EU and in Germany on that principle. We have never done such a thing in this country. We've never had a reckoning, right? We've never had a moment of acknowledgement. And that's why, at least, people, it's everything from the removal of Confederate monuments to unrooting the white supremacy in our jurisprudence. We have to have this moment of reckoning in this country, to where we truly acknowledge what has happened, so we can move forward in a productive way. We cannot, what I learned from from that trip is that we cannot move forward if we do not do that. We're only going to be, as one of my constitutional law professors would say when you were going down the wrong path on your answer, you're merely shifting deck chairs on the Titanic. We're in a sinking ship, right? This is not going to change unless we uproot this at its very core. And the enshrinement of human dignity in our jurisprudence, in practices like visiting institutions, in any number of cultural and tangible ways, is just so important to keep at the front of our face, because we're combating 400 years of white supremacy. We're combating 400 years of patriarchy. We're combating all of these isms that are baked into our system in any number of ways. And unless we have those constant reminders, we're just destined to continue to repeat ourselves.
DA, do you think that that kind of reckoning is possible? And if so, what might it look like?
Well, I think that we are in this moment now with everything that has happened around our country. Of course, we've mentioned COVID-19. We haven't specifically talked about all of the efforts around the country to lift up the fact that systemic racism is at the very core of so many issues and problems, including our justice system in this country. And I think, if anything, that this moment has taught us is that this is not going to be something that we talk a little bit about today, and then tomorrow we move on to the next subject. This is something that goes to the core of every single thing that we do, every policy that we write, every step that we take. And this is not something that is happening, as we've heard so many people say, in this moment. This is truly a movement. It is a human rights movement. It is a civil rights movement, if you will, that will be with us for some time. And I think that is evidenced by the fact that people are still in the streets, people are still protesting, and they're doing so every day. And I think this effort will continue until all of us recognize not only the role that we've played in getting us to this place, but also how we have to all be a part of the conversations and the solutions that can help to move us forward. So I don't think this is something that's going to go away. It's definitely not something that's going to be ignored. And we have to all come to the table to bring all of these ideas that we're talking about here, as well as so many other opportunities that exist for us, so that we can begin to break these 400 years of racism that have infected in everything in our society.
Ms. Habig, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about what you're seeing, if anything, around the issue of reckoning for prosecutors and other state actors. And I'm thinking about some of our partners, including State's Attorney Kim Fox and District Attorney Tori Verber Salazar, who have actually issued apologies at different times. And then the incredible blowback that comes on prosecutors when they do try to push the envelope, and that can be true across the political spectrum. So what do you make of that from the Public Rights Project's vantage point?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that we are at a new moment. And I think the challenge that everyone faces is how to sustain that moment and not just have it be a blip on the radar and then go back to the status quo as usual, perpetuating all of these systemic inequities. And so I think the opportunity for prosecutors is to make the case directly to their own constituents about what safety actually means. You know, as I think Daryl mentioned at the beginning of this, safety has never been actually prioritized for everyone in any community or any jurisdiction. It has been prioritized for white people at the expense of other groups and particularly Black communities. And so that, you know, I think a prosecutor has a particular mantle to have that conversation and to say that if we actually want a prosecutor's office to be about safety and to be about safety for everyone in the community, then we have to actually look at all of the building blocks of people's safety. Are they free from racial profiling? Can they get a job? Can they get housing? Can they provide for their families? Can they get an education that is not in a segregated, rundown school? Can they move into a neighborhood? You know, all of those things determine people's safety. And so I think that prosecutors have an obligation to think about their role and use every tool in their tool belt to actually look at all of the building blocks of people's safety across their communities. And I think that's going to be, as we've seen, there's been a particular targeting of Black women DAs who are trying to move the country forward. And I just want to name that explicitly. The blowback against DAs who are trying to actually think about safety for all of their communities is not just blowback for being on the left or being progressive, it is blowback against Black women in particular. And so that is something that I think all of us who are trying to reimagine what public safety means and what the role of the prosecutor means, we have to not only continue to push every prosecutor to do better and to do more, we also have to back up those that are making progress. And when they are attacked in racist and derogatory ways. And so I think it's on all of us to do both the pushing and the supporting and backing up when people are trying to do the right thing and facing blowback from their communities for it.
Jill, I want to thank you so much for lifting that up because it's a message that I don't think is said enough. As Black women prosecutors, and remember, women of color prosecutors are only 1% of those in the entire country. And so you can only imagine that they're just like a couple of handfuls of us who are out using our voices and our platforms for this most and very important work. But you're so correct. We are attacked in ways that our male counterparts are not. And it makes the work is hard anyway, and we know that, and we signed up for that, but it just really makes the work so much more difficult when we are using what we know is our prosecutorial discretion to make decisions that people and prosecutors have made for hundreds of years without question. But when we do it, we are attacked not only in our jurisdictions, but literally getting death threats from all around the country. And so it's very important to recognize that we have to be protected as well. Yes, our community, and I say this as I engage with my community all the time, I know that, you know, it's with your help that I sit in this position. And I know that you're there to lend your voice and to be in conversation with me about how do we continue to move forward and to push the needle towards reform. But we also need you there for us in these most difficult times when there is so much hatred and racism and vile and derogatory comments as well as threats against our lives that are being made to us every single day. And I think that needs to be said out loud and recognized.
Yeah, I normally don't pile on, but I'm going to pile on here because I'm in a jurisdiction with one of those women, Miss Satana DeBerry, who, you know, from the very beginning, we were really, really supportive of her candidacy and her leadership. And I just want to lift up the sexism in it too. You know, it isn't just vile racist comments. It's attacking, you know, coming from male counterparts, right? Attacking mental acumen and temperament and just all of those old sexist tropes, right? That, you know, we should definitely confront. So I just wanted to name that. And even within our progressive community, right? When you think about who's getting all the shine around leading the progressive prosecutor movement, and I love what Krasner's doing in Philly, but my sisters are putting in work, right? Kim has reduced the county incarceration rate by 25%, real numbers. Satana's putting in work, right? And leading the way on a bail policy and getting folks out of harm's way with COVID. So I just want to name some of the contradictions even within our so-called progressive community, right? In the work that we lift up as most valuable in the work we do.
Thank you.
Sometimes I'm asked after these conversations what the public can do, what listeners can do. And so to that end, I would just encourage everyone who's listening to take every opportunity you can to uplift Black women prosecutors who are working hard to make change, to make the country better for all of us, because DA Becton said it so beautifully. But what is happening is unconscionable, and it's incumbent on all of us to step up and support them. We have a couple of questions for the audience before I ask each of you to conclude with a few thoughts. One is about sexual violence in prison. Have there been changes to the concept that people who are incarcerated can't expect not to be raped? Who should be responsible for addressing issues of sexual violence in prison? If anyone wants to jump in on that.
You know, I'll start. Again, it goes to the conditions of confinement, and far too long, our prisons and our jails have been far away from oversight and community oversight, and therefore all the things that happen in our jails and our prisons are not really communicated to the community. It's not held under a microscope, and we need to change that. I did an op-ed where I talked about right now we're in a moment where we have cell phones, we have video cameras of all of the abuse and interactions that happen on the street. When you think about our prisons and our jails, every single day, there are interactions that never get recorded because there are no cell phones. There are incidents that don't get reported, or when they get reported through the lens of those in charge and those in power. And oftentimes, those reports are skewed toward the individual who got assaulted. And so we need to fundamentally change the oversight and management of our jails and our prisons. And that goes to conditions of confinement, that goes to oversight, and that goes to location and community ownership of our institutions.
Thank you. And we have a question from our partner, Thomas Giovanni, who mentions, Daryl, that you make a great comparison to the reckoning necessary. And Thomas wonders whether you or others on the panel see Americans from all professions and walks of life truly coming to such a place, especially given how every aspect of our culture so overwhelmingly promotes the idea that we as a nation are essentially good and committed to justice. What can prosecutors in particular do to participate in getting to this reckoning? And I think we're thinking beyond simply the issuance of apology, but what is the next threshold for our reckoning beyond that?
Yeah, I think the truth and reconciliation work is important, and I think it's an important first step. I know, one of your colleagues in the policing work, I know police chiefs have done public recognitions of how the very institution of policing helped perpetuate white supremacy and structural racism. Prosecutors can do the same thing. Think about how many cases of racists have not been prosecuted, right? Think about how many wrongful prosecutions have gone forward, right? In just an individual jurisdiction. We don't have to look far and wide for this. People can look in their own jurisdictions where lynchings have happened and prosecutions have not happened, right? Where wrongful convictions have happened and there have been no formal apology. So I think that's a tangible, important, symbolic step that needs to happen. And then, you know, I'm going to say it this way. We need criminal legal affirmative action, right? In the sense that we need to use every lever at our disposal to try to remedy, to make redress for the remedial harm that the criminal legal system has perpetuated on Black and brown folks. We need to do that work. And if we aren't willing to do that work and we're going to say, oh, okay, now it's a new awakening and we're just going to do stuff different, and you ain't got to tell me about that 1996 conviction that I had, and you ain't got to address that I'm still paying off a $50,000 fine, even though that was 20 years ago, and you don't have to address me that I still can't vote in the place of my birth. How is all that? You know, Malcolm X said, you taking a knife out of my back 3 inches when you plunged it 9 inches deep. That ain't helping me, right? That ain't making it right. We got to make this all the way right.
Thinking about
the only other, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
I was just going to say the other, I mean, in terms of really making this real within prosecutors' offices too, we have to think about, like, personnel is policy, right? And we have to think about who is actually in these offices, who, you know, DA Becton is a visionary leader, but she needs people to execute her vision, you know, within her office. She can't do it all on her own. And so how are we recruiting and onboarding and training the next generation of prosecutors? One of the things we do at Public Rights Project is we actually, you know, have fellowship programs to onboard attorneys of color into prosecutors' offices, to train folks who are already in these offices. And so, you know, some of that gets into the day-to-day, more mundane detail, but it has a huge effect on actually how an office runs and how quickly a DA with a different vision can actually execute that vision within an office and change what line prosecutors are doing on a day-to-day basis. And so how we think about the personnel that is actually occupying and furthering these systems is really important.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you each to offer a few concluding thoughts before I ask our friend Ivan Kaloff to join us to close us out with some words, perhaps starting with you, Mr. Atkinson.
The pandemic, the murder, public lynching of George Floyd, and the subsequent arrest and reckoning that has birth related to that, the greater recognition that our economic system and the unbalance around essential workers and who got to go to work and who doesn't have to go to work, and some of the inequities are revealing some of the frailties around not only structural racism and white supremacy, but capitalism and patriarchy and all of these, you know, tethers that are holding us back as a country. This is our moment. We may not get this again, right? This is not destined. In my 50 years, I know conversations, even since it's the 10th anniversary of the new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander writing that book, the conversations that we're having right now around institutional racism, structural racism, white supremacy, they were not happening a decade ago. I can see that change. But change is not destined to continue in a certain direction. You got to be willing to bend and put some elbow grease to bend that moral arc of the universe, right? This is our moment. And let's do everything that we can to do that in this moment, in everyone in their institutional role, because we may not get it again.
Well, that didn't sound like Daryl Downer at all. Ms. Habig?
I want to just say ditto, but I will add, I think this is a moment for every prosecutor and advocate to use every tool they have in their toolbox. This is not a moment to be cautious or conservative. It's a moment to push the limits of what you can do, both in terms of changing who you're prosecuting and why, looking at every aspect of an office, and rethinking structural systems in this country. I think this is not a moment to waste. So I agree with everything Daryl said.
Mr. Richards? Unmute.
When I got appointed to end solitary confinement, I said what Daryl's professor said, is that what we have been charged with is not tinkering around the edges, but going at the heart of the harm of solitary confinement and restrictive housing. And I think this moment, from the moment I came home from prison and I realized my own humanity and my own potential, I swore to fight every single day to help people see the beauty in themselves and to see their potential and not to see the crime that they may have committed to be the crime who they are. And so we are at a moment where we cannot tinker around the edges. We got to go at the heart of it, and going at the heart of it is going at the heart of racism, institutional racism. And if we pretend that it doesn't exist, we are not doing any good. We are doing harm. We have to acknowledge it, and then we have to commit to changing it, because we can't rearrange the chairs. We can't tinker around the edges. We got to go at the heart of it. And for all the time I've been in this fight, this moment is the moment that I have been fighting for every single day. And we are here. We need to take advantage of it and seize it.
DA?
Yeah, I think, of course, I'll say ditto to everything that has been said, but I think we have to continue every single day to keep our focus on ending mass incarceration, starting at the beginning of that pipeline with our youth, because we have to change the way that youth justice is administered in this country so that we do not continue to contribute to bringing our youth into the criminal justice system, and that we're doing everything that we can to give our youth greater opportunities for reform, for treatment, for restorative justice practices, everything that's needed, because our youth really are our future. And then I don't want us to ever stop reminding ourselves that we have a real problem with over-incarceration in this country. Again, 5% of our population of the world, but 25% of the prisoners. And as Daryl said, we have to do everything that we can every single day to bend that arc of justice. This is a humanitarian crisis where we find ourselves, and there's simply far too many people that are currently behind bars. And of course, we have to work on all the underlying issues and inequity in our system, like in our public health system, in our educational system. And we have to try to end all of those racial biases that bring so many people into contact with this justice system. Our immigrant community, we haven't talked about them a lot, but we really have to focus there as well. And I already mentioned our juveniles. We are at that moment in time where we have collectively, with our partners in this work, we have a unique opportunity to address the long-standing systemic problems that help to keep our community safe, but also make our community safe and healthy for everyone. And that has to be our goal. Thank you.
Thank you so much to these outstanding panelists for sharing your experiences and your vision. I hope that everyone feels as inspired as I do that change is possible and urgent. And I'm very pleased to introduce you to Ivan Kala from the Columbia Center for Justice, who will offer some concluding remarks before we close. Everyone stay safe and healthy. Ivan.
Hello, can you guys hear me? Hello, everybody. I just want to say thank you to Lucy and thank you all. This was amazing. I always walk away from these things just like super impressed, a little stressed out too, because the fact that we're still here at this point in 2020 is crazy. And thank you, Daryl, for calling out the elephant in the room. And all you guys. I think it was James Baldwin that said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And until we call those things out and and we talk about the elephant in the room, nothing's going to change. So thank you guys for bringing it out. Racism, classism, sexism, all that nonsense and ignorance. So I have a poem here from a good friend of mine. His name is Cedric Blackwell. He's presently incarcerated at Katsaki Correctional Facility in New York State. He's got 17 years in on a 20-to-life sentence. He's a halified musician. He's a scholar, and he just recently discovered that he's also a poet, and pretty good poet at that. So I have a poem by him here, and it's raw and unedited, but I love this version of it because it comes from his heart. So it's entitled "A Lens Most Inappropriate." Often I wonder when I look to the sky, does God really hear my cry? Does he see the faces awash in tears? Does he soothe the hurt, quell the fears? When shots ring out and a soul is lost, who pays the price? Who bears the cost? Does God heal the broken mother whose child lies dead in the street while the world keeps spinning, never missing a beat? Does he witness the murderous lust of those we're supposed to trust, injecting hate into the earth, their unchecked imagination and subjugation, robbing Black lives of their worth? Cell phones capture a desperate plea for air as life leaks to the ground. The Macocene tears at the seam of the American dream. Freedom, justice, and equality, a worn fallacy. For the Black and brown, there is no purple mountain majesty to be found. But there are grumblings of change, the surge of a tide that won't wane. The believing heart bears no stain. Love made plain cast a light on the abuser's bane. Latched to his hate, he becomes the slave, held by the chain. Read the cardboard signs that punctuate the protest lines, declaring the time for change is near. A people possessed to put brutality to rest, charge the wall without an inkling of fear. Respect existence or expect resistance. We are Black and brown from cuff to sleeve, mighty descendants of mitochondrial Eve. We've endured the shackle, the block, and the whip, battle the force of the Atlantic from the bowels of a ship. We felt the piercing bite of rageful dogs and the powerful blast of the hose. Survived red-hot flames, hurtful names, and the wooden sting of the baton blows. We've come through what we've come to in the face of hate, and you can't quiet the voice for willing to riot for choice because it refuses to resign to its fate. The diverse hue of the alleged few are the lineage of kings and queens, the recipients of I have a dream and by any means of I know why the caged bird sings and the bluest eye, of strange fruit and sweet potato pie, of linoleum dance floors and funky break beats, of hell up in Harlem and down these mean streets. When we meet, don't just look at me. See a crook in me, throw the book at me, see me. You don't have to salute me, but you don't have to shoot me. If you check your ego and warped opinion of me at the door, our encounters will be of growth and imperative. Learn to hear, and we can learn and change the narrative. Allow truth to remind us that the ties that bind us are stronger than the lies that conspire to blind us. That the lessons you've been taught to embrace, all them lies about a superior race, is a practice of a dark art, a cowardly craft, a punctured raft, meant to trick your mind to ignore what we have in kind in exchange for a spiritual opiate, an addictive drug that makes you hate and view me through a lens most inappropriate. Thank you. That was from my good friend, Cedric Blackwell. Thank you guys for this opportunity. It was amazing.